Hello and welcome to my recap of round 14 of the 2024 FIDE candidates. I was a little bit unwell earlier today, but yeah, now feeling reasonably okay. So, for those who need a recap, going into this round, Gukesh was leading with 8.5 points out of 13, playing against one of the chasing pack Nakamura with the black pieces on 8 out of 13. And we're going to see that game in this recap, of course, but also the other pursuers, Caruana and Nepo, also on 8 out of 13, were playing against each other. And this game between Ferrugia and Vidit, obviously neither player having a shot at the first place. They end up just agreeing a draw with the infamous Berlin draw. So we already covered that. Let's get on to the next game as such. And if you have been enjoying these recaps, do make sure to leave a like and also to consider subscribing, as we are going to have some more content, after the candidates, as it were. I'll continue to do the videos. And also, this situation represents a challenge, of you're playing a low-rated player and you want to keep the most winning chances. So, for example, something like c5 and going for a more symmetrical structure may not necessarily be the ideal position in such a circumstance. So this is why Prague played the line that actually was the favorite of mine back in like 2004 to 2007-ish. Of just playing knight d7, e5, and just kind of keeping a bit more tension in the position as such. After e4, the move rook e8 is a slightly unusual move order, but black is going to play ed4 soon anyway, so it is going to transpose. So rook e1, take, c6, h3, just avoiding any knight g4 tricks, as it were. And after queen b6, we kind of get the first critical position of the game where, white would like to attack the pawn on d6, but he also needs to make sure that he consolidates his position at the same time. And at this point, I think that the move knight c2 and going for this might be a better version of what we see in the game. Because now after knight b5, you're able to play the move b3 and just defend the pawn and build up the position with either bishop e3 or bishop b2. White has a pretty stable space advantage here. But we see the difference in the game after knight b3 and now knight e5. That it's no longer so convenient for white to defend the pawn on c4. That an exchange of pawns is just going to be good for black, who's going to get some nice pressure with with moves like bishop e6 and the rook coming in and so forth. And if you move the bishop, then the b2 pawn is going to be on, as it were. So this is why white flicks in the intermezzo bishop e3. I guess hoping for black to just make some retreat with the queen and, allowing white to defend the pawn and consolidate. But, of course, black plays better than that. He plays the move c5, asking white, again, how he's going to defend the pawn on c4. I guess he didn't play knight d2 because he was nervous about the pawn on b2 being hanging, but turns out technically this is actually probably quite decent for white with the attack on the pawn and knight c7 fork and the queen a bit stuck. White could have played it this way, but instead he went bishop to f1. Black played bishop e6, and the position that arises, I think, is one that Prague was pretty happy with, I think, where, white has the bishop pair, but black has got some pretty good activity, and maybe black should just go queen b4 and try to attack the pawn on c4 in this way. Realizing, that a move like rook e1 is actually falling for queen e1 and some tactics like this that you have to be a bit careful of. But instead of that, black plays knight e4. White goes king g2, a5, trying to create some problems here. And, maybe white should just even play a4 and, just make the point that things are all locked up and that, if we're able to just kick black the black pieces, then white should be doing pretty well, I suppose. But knight d2 was played in the game. We had take. And because white has more space, you're kind of happy as black to trade off the minor pieces and just have good squares to a piece to the left on the board. Rook ab1, a4, just trying to fix b2 as a possible target here. Game went queen c2, queen a6, bishop to d2. Black jumped his bishop in with bishop to d4. Obviously a very nice square for this piece. Bishop to c3, take. Actually, white took with the b pawn, which is kind of interesting. Something like queen c3 would definitely be a lot more normal here. But black's also just very solid. Even if you just build up on the e file, it's kind of hard for white to make any sort of meaningful progress, let's say. But BC3, yeah, kind of makes things a bit more unbalanced, and yeah, it does give black some scope to try to exploit the weakness on C4. Of course, white's going to try to do the same thing with B7, but I think it's easier to get at white's weaknesses somehow. Also, partly because the bishop is just really passive and really struggles to find a good target, whereas the knight does have scope to improve its position. For what it's worth, maybe the best option here is just to play king g7 and maybe just build up a bit, but it doesn't make the biggest difference in the world. Well, the game continued b6, and for now there was some fairly, you could say, quiet maneuvering. White plays this move f4 that, is trying to avoid the knight coming in at e5, for example. Queen c7, queen d2, knight f6. All pretty standard here. Take, queen d7, and at this point, I think it's a position where you actually maybe don't want to play too slowly here as white. I think you do want to try to make something happen and make your bishop work in a sense. So I think a move like g4 and trying to push these pawns might have been the best way for white to maintain the balance here. But the game saw rook to b1, which does create some interesting opportunities. Computer kind of likes that, even just sacking the pawn and taking the e-file, but in the game, Prague just plays automatic rook b8, just defending the pawn. Again, white probably should just try to, hold back the b5 break, because that's going to be black's main way of trying to make progress in a position like this. And indeed, looking at how the game played out, we can sort of see here that, even if white plays queen d2, I think it's not the most likely, let's say, that he loses from here. Sure, black's going to be better, but it's not, not so bad for white in a sense. But instead, also I probably should point out, by the way, bishop a4 is not really a thing, because you do have queen e4, and you do get back the pawn with interest, as it were, with this fork. Just I should point that one out. So I played queen e1 in the game, and maybe his hope was that after takes, that the pawn a4 would become a bit of a weakness here. But the problem, though, is that black just plays b5, and it turns out that with the d5 pawn now a weakness and the rook coming in, that this is actually a very bad position for white. And Prague converted it pretty well in the game. Let's see how it ended. Bishop a4. Probably bishop a4 is not the best move, but giving up a pawn for free is not something you really want to do either, of course. Well, we had bishop a4, rook a5, and the play here almost reminds me of some games I used to play in the Benko Gambit, with white having the space disadvantage in a sense. Rook e3 was played, rook a2. If white does play a move like king g1, the king does get cut off, and you can even play moves like h5, put the, well, I was going to say king on f8, but maybe even better is just go rook d2 and just target the white weaknesses in that sort of way. But the game saw king f3, rook h2 sort of takes advantage of the weakness of h3. White goes rook e7, they're hoping to try to create some counterplay, or at the very least sort of shut out the black rook a bit and leave the rook struggling to get back into the game, as it were. But Prague realized, that there's no need to allow this when you can just play king f8, kick the rook, play rook c2, and just hit the second weakness, as it were. White played rook a3, h6, bishop a4, rook c1. And I mean, at this point, it's just very hard for white to find a good answer to the idea of just playing like h5 and putting the rook on d3 and the knight on e4. This is going to make it really tough for white to effectively defend their weaknesses, and if you do play a move like c4 to try to deal with it later, then c4 then becomes the weakness. White played a move rook b3 in the game, which admittedly accelerates things a bit. After c4 and rook d1, black is just perfectly poised to start collecting all the white pawns. Knight rook d3, king to g2 to defend the pawn on a3. Black plays knight d5, and it's interesting to note that even the rook endgame is actually going to be winning for black here, where if white does try to attack the pawns, you can just play rook d2 and defend it with d5, and there's just not a whole lot that white can really do when his king and rook are going to be so passive. In the game after h4, we had rook d2, king f3, rook d3. At this point, there's even like a kind of cool computerish line where you can play like f5 and go king f6 and sublimate with d5, which is pretty epic. But okay, the way that was played in the game by Prague with rook h3 is also good enough to win. After king d4, king f6, there's just no good answer to white to the idea of just simply taking all these pawns. Like if g5, you can even go king e6 and just let them take h6. Because you're going to pick up all these pawns anyway with your rook, and the other idea of king f6, you just meet rook a6 with king e6, and just make sure that they're not going to get counterplay with a passed c pawn, and then you're just going to take these pawns and again just win. So very nice win by Prague, and maybe not the most critical from the tournament point of view, but I think quite an inspiring game for fans of the King's Indian for sure. Showing against a Fianchetto variation, even if you don't equalize, you're still going to get chances to win against a low-rated player. Let's now see the next game that was sort of critical for the standings. Well, the first game was critical for the standings in Nakamura against Gukesh, and it's true that, Nakamura had played e4 in all the previous games, and this being a must-win game, decided to play d4 and just try to keep a little more tension in the position. Of course, Queen's Game Accepted is a pretty reliable system nowadays, and Bishop e7 is already a little bit of a small surprise by Gukesh, because normally like c5 and either a6 or knight c6 are kind of the lines to nowadays. But Bishop e7 is just saying, well, it's kind of funny in a way, because this actually is a system that I face quite a lot in my online games on chess.com, funnily enough. But so the idea is that, you can sort of say, well, you're just developing naturally, like you can castle, you can play c5, and kind of just play chess in a way from a position like this, where what you're often going to get in this sort of situation is, something like an IQP position, like rook d1, knight c6, and just very typical IQP position. White might be a tiny bit better, but black is also going to be very, very solid in this instance. And it's a way to just, avoid fury and just get a position on the board as such. Where you have ideas like bishop f6, and you can try to pressure the pawn and such. In the game, white played the move knight to c3. And after c5, maybe the castling is just the simplest here. Where, Nakamura's move a3, trying to make a hidey hole for the bishop on a2. It might be a little bit early in this position, perhaps, in terms of seeing the maximum problems. Because, if you play a move like d takes c5 and, try to go for the e4 break and such, it's definitely a plan, this sort of Thurman kind of system, but overall black should be doing fine. Like, as long as you remember the idea of knight c6 and just trading off with knight d4 when they go e4, then you're not really going to have any major problems here as black. But this may have, in hindsight, been a better try than the game, because after queen e2, b5, bishop a2, c takes d4, at this point, a move ed4 might seem a very automatic recapture, but it is true that rook d1 probably asks slightly more questions, where, once again, if you play d3 and, try to get a symmetrical position, white can go e4 and does get some, piece pressure to kind of work with while black is a little bit behind in development, as it were. And otherwise, if you play like bishop to b7 or something like this, well, then you have ideas to go for d5 and try to get some play in this sort of way. At least white is kind of getting a dynamic position with some chances, as it were. It is true after rook d1 that black could even play a move like b4 and play it in a similar way to what we'll see in the game, because after e takes d4, actually the immediate et4 in the game, actually b4 is a very, very precise move here, where in this way, if white plays takes, you just go knight c6 and get your pawn back. And it's just very hard for white to really create any sort of imbalance or any sort of pressure when black is just, rock solid with absolutely no weaknesses and very comfortable squares for his knights and very nice long diagonal for the bishop as well. It's going to be very hard, for white to achieve anything. So someone explained some of Nakamura's moves in the game where he is wanting to, maximize the chances to create something in the position. It is true that, Gukesh handled it very, very well, just, putting the pressure on the knight. Obviously, the exchange of pieces is something that black's pretty happy to see, with some nice pressure against the d4 pawn, and again, very hard for white to create anything here. So white plays knight d3, just trying to keep the pieces on. Knight d5 is a very good reply. You do want to exchange off the minor pieces, especially when facing the IQP. And if you go knight e4, like black can even just go back and, you're not really getting anywhere. So white plays bishop d2, trying to keep some play in the position. Bishop c3, knight d7. Bishop b1's played, trying to attack the king side. And then midly, though, the king side attack's probably not the most likely to succeed, just because the center is quite open and, central play is typically going to trump flank play. And even the question of how to defend this pawn is not the easiest one to answer here. Like a passive move like bishop e3 is not really in the spirit of the position. It just gives black, more squares and makes it easier to attack some other weaknesses. So this is not really a thing, and bishop d3 is in the game is probably the best try here. After take queen d4, of course, this is winning a pawn because of the pin on the bishop, as it were. So rook b d1, queen a4. Might play queen b7. I do like this move, forking the bishop and the pawn. Bishop c5, and you might be wondering why white didn't just play the move bishop queen a6 directly here. But the problem is then there's moves like queen to h4 as such, where black's just going to get a really strong attack on the king that actually turns out to be winning technically. So for this reason, this is why Nakamura played knight bishop e1 first, defending this and preparing to take the pawn. Of course, it starts to give black time to go a5 and defend his extra pawn. White play queen b5, and white's hope was basically to try to prompt black into doing something very aggressive like queen f4, and this is something of course that the players were considering in after the game in the press conference, like what happens in this sort of position. But it turns out after queen e5, queen a5, there's no bishop f2 because the bishop queen is protected. But after knight g4, you can just play queen d2, and it sort of turns out that queen h5, h4 just doesn't really lead anywhere for black, where g5 is covered by the white queen, and queen e5, queen f4 just neutralizes the attack, and obviously there's something white would be quite happy to get in the game, where you've got the imbalances with the bishop pair and the passed a pawn to try to get some chance to win the game. But Gukesh took the professional route of play descending, where 99% of the time it's going to be a draw, but where you're also never going to lose. And if Caruana and Nepomniachtchi draw and you draw as well, then you win the tournament as such. So kind of no need to go crazy. The rest of the game, was just pretty sort of normal. Like there were, a couple of different things that the players could have tried, but was never really going away from just being a draw essentially. White's bishop pair does give him pretty reasonable, I'd say, drawing compensation for the pawn. The normal continuation would just be just trade off everything and just admit that it's just a dead draw. They ended up playing on for some more moves, but the result was never really in doubt here. Bishop b5, bishop a3, and of course, the opposite coloured bishops obviously will increase the drawish tendencies in such a position. So black, is not even too concerned about the the extra pawn being lost, because there's just not really much for either side to play for, and obviously you're pretty happy, just to trade off the pawns and just liquidate. After bishop e7, h4, pieces are just starting to come off the board, and not too much really happening, just pawns getting traded. White's only hope is to try to make something of the a pawn, but it's not a very realistic hope, let's say. And after flicking in some more checks and the game going on a bit longer, the engine will tell you that rook f5 initially is not the most precise, but it really doesn't matter. Even when white does manage to win the exchange, which is kind of the best case scenario, it's just an ironclad draw with rook versus bishop. Even without the pawn, it would still be a dead draw. And they just found a way, just to force the pieces off, and the draw was agreed here. So now we kind of know where things stand going into the last game between Caruana and Nepomniachtchi, which did finish after this Nakamura Gukesh game, by the way. Where basically, if Caruana or Nepo win, then they play a playoff against Gukesh for the title. As we see here, though, we can see the game ended in a draw, so we already know from this, that Gukesh won the tournament, and not just that, but actually very historic to become by a big margin, the youngest player to win the candidates. The youngest one before that was Kasparov at 20 years of age, and Gukesh has done it at 17, which is very, very, very impressive in that respect. And not just the result, but also quality of players. We've seen these recaps from Gukesh just being very, very high, very consistent, and really just making less mistakes than his opponents at the end of the day. So congrats to him, and let's see how this Caruana and Nepomniachtchi game transpired, because this was a really crazy game. I think that it might well even be the most exciting game of 2024, honestly, at this point, even though it ended in a draw. Now Nepomniachtchi, it's true, he has a lot more experience, let's say, with Nimzo Indian than the Queen's Gambit declined. And of course, for Caruana as well, like he had played 1e4 for this whole tournament. Now he's playing d4, trying to get a bit more play going. Avoiding stuff like the Petrov, as it were. So at bishop b4, e3, h6, and it's kind of like a pseudo Rogozin where, white hasn't played the move knight f3, which does mean, as we'll see in the game, that white gets options to, try and kick away their knight at the right moment. But even so, it's still quite a playable approach for black, as the engines have shown. That you can also play like knight e2, and try to go h4 is like one way you can play it, where you try to keep your structure a bit more solid. But the way that Caruana played it is also pretty standard, just queen c2, h5, f3, and just play this position where black has the bishop pair, but where your structure is maybe a little bit more harmonious. So we had to move bishop to d3 here. I mean, there's various moves white can play, like a3 as a move, e4, g4, f4. There's a lot of different plans available for white in this sort of structure, but I think it's sort of hard to argue against just developing the pieces normally. In this position, maybe knight d7 is a bit more precise than the Pomnishy's c6, where c6 maybe is a move you want to wait more for the middle game in a respect, but c6 not going to make a massive difference here, let's say. It's still both pretty thematic moves. And after castles, again, maybe white could consider playing a3 and, asking where the bishop's going to go. But, yeah, in the game, castles was played, bishop d7, f4, bishop to g4, just hitting the rook and getting out of f5 to win the bishop, as it were. White now played the move of knight to f3, which, in hindsight, maybe a move like rook e1 might be a little more precise, just sort of keeping a little more flexibility of where the knight is going to go. And also preparing e4 to try to open up their king in the center. But I think objectively it doesn't make too big of a difference. Actually, when I kind of saw this game, I actually was thinking of bishop e2 as being a quite appealing option as well, like just to get rid of black's bishop pair and try to play on the light squares. But okay, it's a very different game if this happens, of course. White played knight f3. And the best bet for black here, in retrospect, is probably to just take on f4. With the idea that if g takes, you can sort of go queen e7, and sort of e4 is going to be kind of less effective in this version when you're sort of able to long castle and just sort of defend in this way. Whereas if you compare it to what happened in the game, like one difference you might notice here is that after takes, and like long castles, for example, is that now the move knight d5 is a lot more effective than before. Where, the fact that this pawn is still kind of under pressure also sort of works in white's favor. So it's just these little subtleties, that sort of make black's life just a little bit more difficult. And if you do play gf4 trying to transpose back, white's not forced to take on f4 either. They can play like rook e1 and, threaten bishop c6 and, at least get a bit more of an interesting position on the board that way. But in the game, black played bishop c3, and I think in hindsight we can sort of say that Caruana did kind of outplay Nepo in this game. Note, by the way, of course, that, d4 takes, they can't take the bishop because of the pin on the queen to the king. So black played bishop f3, gf3, he did it this way, take, just trying to trade off everything. Of course, gf4 and long castles would give white, quite a few pawn weaknesses, which is not really ideal, let's say. But the move g4 was very, very nice by Caruana. Just hitting this pawn here, and, black should probably play a move like h4 and, just long castle next move. But yeah, maybe he was concerned about like rook he1 and maybe something like this. But it turns out that despite the appearances, it's not that easy for white to find like a great discovery. And okay, it's not the computer idea is that, bishop d7, you can actually play like king b8 and actually sacrifice a full piece. But with the idea that bishop f8, rook c8 kind of allows you to, end up winning like, well, not winning, but exchanging the queen for two of your rooks. And yeah, it looks like the rook should be better, but somehow, yeah, the engine just thinks it's just equal because of the counterplay against with the h pawn and so forth. But yeah, not the most obvious thing, of course, from a human point of view. So I can sort of understand why Nepo ended up playing long castles immediately, even though technically it proves to be a mistake because of Fabi's next move of d5. Just hitting the pawn on c6 here, and c5 doesn't really help because just d6 is going to decisively open up the attack to the black king. In almost a kind of desperation, you could say, black played the move h4, dc6, and knight c5. Like, they're just trying to like make things as difficult as possible for white to convert it. And of course, it makes sense, to play as, obviously the last round, the tension is going to be higher than usual. I really like the next move of king b1. This was a really nice move by Caruana, realizing that bc6 isn't really a thing, because you just go queen to b4, and, you can just play like rook c1 and basically almost just win a piece directly in a sense with the pin. So that's sort of the reason why I think why black played b6. I mean, the engine's kind of critical a lot of the moves, but if you're losing, like, you have to try to make things as messy as possible. It's not really about what the engine says loses the most slowly, but, what gives the most chance the opponent to go wrong, as it were. Now, at this point, I think if Caruana plays bishop d7 and just kind of shuts out the rooks, obviously you can't, we even have c7, that's actually going to be even better again. But, yeah, bishop d7, I think if you find this, you probably just win here. Because even if you play knight a6, like, the bishop is completely paralyzing black, so it definitely makes your life easy, but... Okay, rook d7 in the game is also winning, however. Like, after takes. Of course, the rook is under attack, so rook d8. White played queen d4, knight d7, and... Yeah, with the pin on the knight, this should just be a relatively clear win for white. If black goes king c7 to defend, you can even, like, just take on f4 and basically have a winning position. Knight e5, rook e1 is still pinning him up and is going to be decisive here. Like, say, rook a5, d5, queen a4. And either a7 falls or you get an f4 and win the knight with the pin. And, of course, black can't really stop both of them at once. So this is why black played the move queen c5 again, just desperately trying to make something happen. But with the move queen d2 here, yeah, you just have a decisive pin, and the only hope really for black to try to turn this around is the h pawn. I think though if white just plays a move like f4, there's not much black can really do at this point. Like if you play h2 for example, then we can even just take the pawn in the absolute worst case. And well, if they play king c8, you're running into rook c1, so you can sort of feel how black just isn't really able to avoid the loss of material when you get to this point. Well, in the game, we had the move of bishop e4, trying to sort of cover that way. And I mean, to be fair, it doesn't spoil anything by any means. Like, the idea of putting the queen on d5 is of course really tying black up here. I guess the only thing we could say, and maybe this is sort of with the benefit of hindsight of how the game played out, but even though Engine is giving like +5 here, like, it is a bit of a messy position with this pass pawn h2. It means black's always going to have some sort of tricks in the position. Now at this point, like, maybe the move f4 and, just covering this might just be the simplest here. Just keeping black pinned up and sort of buying that time to, push your own g-pawn or, bring your king a little bit to a safer position. But the move queen h7, of course, doesn't spoil anything either. I think that, FIDE continued to play it well. We had queen h6, queen to c7, g5, rook to g8. White played a move rook h1. I mean, I guess we can sort of see here that even though it's still completely winning, it's still a little bit tricky now, where black is at least managing to free his pieces, which was not the case some moves ago. Which is kind of why I suggested the f4 plan a bit earlier. But okay, still it is technically winning here. And after knight to c5, I mean, the most obvious move probably to most people is just to, take the pawn h2, just kill all the counterplay. But okay, this does allow takes and rook takes g5, and, white does actually have to be quite precise, because queen endgame, for example, would not be enough to win. So, like, the only reason that, this is winning for white is because of a little bit of a geometry with queen to h8, so preparing rook h7 to win the queen. But if queen c8, then queen d4 is, again, like, the key move. Like, you have to be very, very accurate here, or you just lose all your advantage as white. So a very concrete continuation. You threaten the pawn and rook h8, but at the same time you stop their counterplay with rook g1, and it turns out that when you get the position sort of in this version, like rook c2 and rook c5 in this, yeah, it turns out that this queen endgame is going to be a win for white, just because the black pawns are weaker than usual, and black is a lot slower to create perpetual check threats, and You think about the only real petrol check for it would be to somehow get in like a4 and the black queen to b3, but the white queen on d5 just covers it perfectly. But in the game where I play bishop h7, it doesn't throw away the win, but it does make things a lot more tricky. Where black played this move rook g5, which, it turns out after this we had queen g5, queen h7, and yeah, here white has to be quite precise, where it turns out that one thing you're going to notice is that the eval bar is like just going to go crazy with this game, but what white had to do is he basically had to play to move king a2 to keep a winning position. The point being that if black does give checks, which is, the main way to try and swindle it, after knight b3, white can play to move king b1, and it turns out that if black does play... Well, I mean, queen h7, king a2 is pretty clearly a dead end, but if black does play queen f3, it turns out that you don't want to play rook h2, because then queen d1 and knight c1, and it just ends up being a draw by repetition, but white has this key move of queen to e5 available. And once you take the pawn like this, then you are going to be winning. Black does eventually run out of checks, as we can see here. Queen d5 might look scary, but you have queen h5, and you're able to just keep harassing their queen and not allow them to get in a good discovered check, as it were. Like, you're always going to be able to like kind of recycle with the king, like triangulating with the king, so they lose time each time they do the checks. Anyway, the game saw king a1, and this did allow black to play the move of queen c2, which is what Nepo played here. Now the players have got to the time control, and it's kind of interesting actually in a way to see, like, even here, like, the players had got the time control, but, of course we're in some time trouble before, so making things, it can take a little bit of time, like, to adjust after just being very short of time and having all this time on the clock. But, yeah, after queen c2 now there are some real... ideas of like perpetual checks or bring the knight in, as it were. I mean, queen and knight is just a very good attacking force when they work together. So we had queen to g8, king a7, king a2, a4 is a nice move here, just preparing to use the b3 square in some form. Also preparing knight b3, d3 without allowing a queen b3 idea in the future. So white plays move f4, and at this point, again, actually, black still has to be very precise in this position to save the game because of his material deficit. And it turns out that actually the move you need to find as black is king to a6. The idea of king to a6 is basically to prepare the move knight d3. But if you play knight d3 immediately, then queen g7 comes with a check, which sort of buys white the time to go queen c3 and like stop the whole knight c1, knight b3 machination because of the x-ray. So it turns out that, this is why king a6 has to be played to prepare knight d3. The checks might look kind of scary, but what sort of helps black is that, black does have, some quite clear threats against the white king, and the black king, much like in 4-player chess, actually proves surprisingly safe on b5. In the game, black played the move knight b3, trying to get it this way. But that does allow the same problem we saw before, where the queen gets to c3, knight c1 check is covered, and white should be winning in this position, normally speaking. But let's see how it played out. Queen g2, queen c4, king b7. Well, this is fine. Like, obviously, you're trying to checkmate the black king. So knight c5 trying to cover it. And white found exactly the right move here. There is a threat to queen, so queen f1 just stops that very nicely. Queen d5, king b1, queen f5, king a1, and I mean, if you play normally, you're just going to lose here as black, so, queen c2, you got to try it and, try to make something happen with the knight and the queen. White played the move f5, correctly not seeing any ghosts here, because knight d3, if they do play knight b3 and knight d2, by the way, turns out that, you can just play like queen g2 and, their threats end up being a little bit empty, let's say. Also, if you're able to get a check with the rook, that's also going to be mate, more or less. So that's why the move knight d3 was played, but rook b1 covers it all very nicely. Knight c5, f6. So far, white hasn't put a foot wrong in the last moves. Now black goes knight d2 in a more appealing version with the with the attack on the rook. White, by the way, shouldn't play the move rook c1 because the queen is also under attack. So that's why white plays a check first. We have our rook c1, queen b3, king to a1, and black has to figure out a way to not get his king mated, let's say. So he plays the move queen to e6, trying to cover things. And yeah, this was sort of the final key moment. Actually, not even the final key moment of the game, but one of the key moments of the game. Where at this point, black is threatening to go knight b3 and get rid of all the pieces and draw. And the move rook c1, surprisingly enough, actually is not winning the game in this position. Where it turns out that you have to play either rook d1 or rook to e1. With the idea being that basically you play king b1 here and just again kind of like triangulate with the king in a sense, sort of realizing that, well, first of all, like queen f6, queen h2, like once you get rid of the h2 pawn, it becomes a lot easier to convert this as white. We bring the queen in and such into the position. But if black does play something like queen e6, again, the sort of idea is that we kind of just triangulate with the king as such, like king c5, king b1, and we just like play king a1 and sort of make them play knight b3, so they're kind of always losing a tempo every time we do this like ring around the rosy kind of thing, if that makes sense. Well, I mean, it's basically triangulation, as I mentioned before. But instead of this, white played the move rook c7, and yeah, it turns out there's actually no checkmate here. Like after rook queen a8, king b5, for example, there's actually not really a sensible check for white against the black king. So Caruana's idea was to play f7. This is what he did in the game. And after knight b3, king b1. Yeah, it turns out the line for black here is a little bit special, let's say. Like to draw, he has to find this move of knight d2, which has a couple of points to it. I mean, first of all, king a1, knight b3, just repeating moves. But if king c1 is played, then black can even just go knight b3, and if you run your king too far out in the open, you're actually going to be losing with the queen getting the g1 with a tempo, as it turns out. But if white plays king c2, then black's point is he can actually sacrifice the knight with queen to g6. And if white takes a knight, and there's not, I guess, a whole lot of choice. Yeah, it turns out that this actually ends up being a perpetual check, where you sort of use the fact that the king can't move to the c file because of queen c7. You kind of use that in your favor. And you're also taking advantage of the fact they can't really block with the queen either because of the black pawn being ready to queen in that instance, and with a check at that. So you end up just getting this position where white just can't get out of the checks, and it just ends up being a draw basically. You just keep checking their king, and yeah, even without the h pawn, it actually ends up being a draw as well. Just keep on tying the white king up to the defense of the queen. Like you just keep skewering him, and there's nothing they can do here. So very fun little example. Actually, it even gets better in a way, because like say you play king g3 and you sack the queen. Yeah, even with an extra rook, it just ends up being a draw because you can't really go to the f file because of queen f2, and if you try to go to the h file and go this way, black can just take the rook and just make a draw in that way as such. So a very fun little sequence that Nepo could have done, but in the game he did not see it, and he played the move queen f5, which, as I mentioned before, kind of allows white to establish a control again. Yeah, king a2, knight c5, queen a8, and yeah, it's still a little bit tricky here, as we'll see with the game. Where in this point, after queen a8, king b5, this was white's last chance to win it actually. Where it's a tactic actually in the press conference, like it sort of looked obvious to the players in hindsight. But okay, it's also true, like Caruana has like 1 minute on the clock in this instance, is just basically surfing the increment. The way that the game played, well, before we get to that, I'll show you what the winning line is. So the answer is you have to play queen at e8 check. Of course, king a5, you just go rook a7, and king a c4, you can just take the pawn a forward check. So you kind of have to go king a6, and then after queen at e2, again, this little bit geometry is kind of the key, where if black does play a move like b5, then yeah, you just play the move rook a6, and it just all fits together after that. Like king a7, you can go queen e7, and your pawn will queen, and you will win. And if king b7, queen b5 comes with check, and that's pretty straightforward as well. And of course, king a5, queen e2 will be mate. So yeah, it's basically like just a 2 to 3 move tactic, but yeah, not much time to find it in an actual game. Also, if they do play knight d3, yeah, you can even just play like queen h2, and that's going to be safe, as it were. So in the game, white plays queen c6, and yeah, now you can't go back anymore because it'll just be acclaimed by free-fold repetition. So white plays rook e7, trying to keep the game going, but after queen f1, the threat of queening the pawn along with the threat of perpetual check does mean that it is going to be equal, and the players played out for various moves, trying to, do something to avoid a draw that, is obviously like a bad outcome for both players, given that they both need to win to catch Gukesh. But yeah, after rook e4, it turns out that even the extra pawn is not really changing a whole lot, just because the threat to queen is just so strong here. So queen e7, queen a8, and eventually end up getting this queen ending that, I mean, it's just a dead draw. Like, the extra pawn doesn't really lead to anything. Like, the only way that black could possibly lose this is if he somehow blunders, like, a exchange of queens into a losing pawn ending. But, like, even if, let's say, you play king a6 and allow this, like, even this ending is still a draw, funnily enough. Not that black has any reason to go for it, but you get the idea. So after queen f7, king b8, yeah, queen e8. I mean, they played on some moves, but yeah, the result was never really in doubt, you could say. Yeah, just shuffling the pieces around, just, hoping the opponent just makes some sort of blunder, because, well, if he blundered before, maybe he'll blunder again, but yeah, just wasn't to be. Nepo defended it well, and, there's nothing you can really do in Caruana's shoes in this case, and yeah, they finally, admitted it and just agreed to draw it at this stage. So yeah, pretty painful, game for both players. Like, of course, Jan Nepomniachtchi didn't really have any chances to win this game, but of course for Caruana, yeah, it's like a so close yet so far case of, just being like one move essentially off making the playoff against Gukesh. But yeah, with that kind of is conclusion of the tournament, where Gukesh is, like I said before, made history with becoming the challenger to Ding Liren for the World Championship title, at just the age of 17. Yeah, I think it's going to be like very, very exciting match. And, if you've watched some of the like press conferences as I did recently before this, recording this video, then yeah, you might have also noticed like how like calm and mature and, very professional that Gukesh is like in his approach to chess overall and in his approach to the tournament. Definitely very inspiring, can sort of, understand that, why, so many people, myself included, were, yeah, really cheering for him to, like, win this event. Especially, like, just I've seen, like, just how well he was playing even from the very first rounds, like, back in round two, like, when he beat Prague with the black pieces, that's sort of when I thought, okay, like, Gukesh might actually win this whole thing, and yeah, that's what happened. So, yeah, do let me know in the comments below, like, I was normally asked, like, what was your favorite game of the round, but actually, like, what was your favorite game of the whole tournament? I feel is like a more apt question. And yeah, like, how do you feel about Gukesh winning? Like, is it as satisfying a conclusion for you as it is for me? What do you think of his chance against Ding Liren in the World Championship match? Definitely interested to know your thoughts on that in the comments below. And yeah, it's been a fun journey as well. Like, I mean, I took a bit of a long break from like recording the videos, but yeah, I guess in time I kind of realized, it doesn't really matter how many views you have. Like, it's about, how much you kind of enjoy doing it. And, I've really enjoyed like going really deep into this tournament. And, that's going to be the case, like, regardless of, the sort of external metrics, as it were. So, yeah, and I'm looking forward, yeah, to, doing some more videos for you guys as well. Don't know if it's going to be like daily videos, but, we'll see how I feel and how things go from there. Yeah, I hope that you really enjoyed this series, and yeah, I'll see you for the next videos in the next days or whatever the case may be. Yeah, so have a good day, everyone.